Bonjour, good morning. First of all, I should explain, in case anyone doesn't recognize the blue striped scarf, that today is National Prostate Cancer Awareness Day. So I've never been known for fashion statements, so I just want to make sure that everyone knows that that is why you'll see many members of Parliament wearing a blue scarf or a blue tie today. Thank you for joining me this from changes brought in through Bill C-38 and through Budget 2012 on local communities and local problems being created through the reckless cuts that occurred in the spring. And I want to look ahead at what I see on the fall parliamentary calendar that all Canadians should be concerned about. First thing I want to share with you, we know that Parks Canada received well above the average of other departments, severe cuts. The overall cuts in the 2012 budget came to 5% of spending. There were several entities that got 10% cuts. Those were CBC, CEDA, our Overseas Development Agency, and Parks Canada. Now, some people may feel, and maybe Stephen Harper feels, that Parks Canada is an easy place to make cuts because you don't have to do anything to protect ecological integrity in our parks. Clearly, Mr. Harper believes that parks should have more visitors, more tourists, and that those visitor experiences can be privatized, such as with the Jasper Iceway and now the Banff Hot Springs being allowed to have private for-profit operations on them. But our national parks are more than the tourist visitor experience. They also involve public safety, and that's where the cuts hit the ground in a way that I think most Canadians would find quite alarming. The cuts are so severe that in some parks, at least, to my definite personal knowledge, forest fires and rescues are beyond the reach of Parks Canada personnel. They've lost so much capacity that they can't put out forest fires in a national park, and they have to rely on local, in some cases, volunteer firefighting services. To give a specific example, on the Gulf Islands National Park within my riding, there were 2 forest fires this summer, Tumbo Island and on Saturna Island, where Parks Canada staff couldn't get there. Parks Canada staff had to watch as the local forest fire fighting group, Saturna Islands Fire Service, which has one paid staff person, the fire chief, and everybody else is volunteer, dealing with a very difficult fire that was halfway up a cliff rock face, and it required rappelling down the rock face. Volunteer firefighters did this, and then the Provincial Forest Fire Service showed up with helicopters with water buckets to help put out that fire. Now, if you look at a map of Saturna Island, you'll see it's virtually half national park, and interspersed all around the edges of the park are homes. So this is a significant public safety issue when a national park decides it can no longer manage rescues or putting out fires. And that's been the case in more than one national park across the country this summer. As well, in C-38, we changed the law so that now national park wardens are required under C-38 to operate as law enforcement officers for any law that's being violated. They're now required to carry firearms, and they are required to be available to pursue any other criminal act within a national park. It's not clear that they would have the benefit that the RCMP officers do, that you should never send a lone officer into a remote area, that they should always be 2. That doesn't appear to be the case for National Park Service staff, who would be required to go in to deal with any criminal wrongdoing. So on top of a 10% cut, they've had to take on new duties. And to be responsible for those new duties, there are now fewer officers. Just by way of example, in the national parks, if you take the rough number of park wardens that existed for one of the major national parks in the Rockies, you would have had in the past about 30 park wardens. Now there are about 6. Now, it's true that unlike the 30 park wardens who were there before, the 6 who are there now will have firearms with them to be able to pursue criminal activity, but 6 park wardens can't do the job that 30 used to do, and the budget cuts in the resource conservation issues are so severe, they've actually reduced the number of national incident management teams already, and on the ground, we are experiencing an inability of Parks Canada to respond to rescue or fire situations. That's one area of cuts. Another is to maintain the protection of endangered species. Again, an example from my own riding. As part of the National Recovery Strategy for Northern and Southern Resident Killer Whales, or orcas, and this is a copy of the DFO report that explains what the Species at Risk Act requires of them for the protection, conservation, and restoration of orca populations. Part of the requisite job is to make sure that whale watching operations, which are a big economic boon to many parts of coastal Canada. We have a lot of whale watchers, and it's great. It's a fabulous ecotourism experience. But you have to follow the law. You have to stay a requisite distance away from the whale populations, or the enjoyment of whales in the wild turns into harassment of whales and impedes their ability to recover. So there's been a straight watch operation run by CETUS Research and Conservation Foundation that makes sure, with federal government funding through the Species at Risk Act, through Environment Canada, to this operation in southern Vancouver Island and other locations on Vancouver Island, to monitor what the whale watch groups are doing. Their funding was just completely cut, which leads me to what I expect to see in the fall. We've heard that there'll be changes to the Species at Risk Act. It worries me that a service being performed consistent with the federal government's statutory obligations under the Species at Risk Act to protect resident orca whale populations is being cut, to me, as a foreshadowing of changes coming in the Species at Risk Act. We've heard from Minister of Environment Peter Kent that they plan to make changes. Originally, those changes were rumored to be included in the upcoming omnibus budget bill. We now hear that they will be taken separately, and the reason for that, through the various sources that I've heard, is that even the provinces don't want to take on the responsibilities the feds want to shovel off on them as quickly as possible. The reality is that cutting the funding to a small operation, minimal amount of money, to keep an operation going where skilled people, knowledgeable conservationists out on the water protect whale populations, that's been completely eliminated. The other thing we see coming, which I think deserves more attention than it's getting, certainly more than it's getting in the House of Commons, is looking forward again towards what's going to happen this fall. I'm very concerned about the omnibus budget bill. I, of course, will read it carefully. But we also know that by November 12th, the Government of Canada must decide on the bid by Nexen, the bid by CNOOC to purchase Nexen, CNOOC being the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company. We are still hearing, even the official opposition, the NDP, only goes on about net benefit. When is someone going to talk about national security? We're talking not about a commercial venture. We're not talking about a private sector operation coming from China. We're talking about a state-owned operation of Communist China, the same state that owns Sinopec, the same state that owns PetroChina. Communist China owns CNOOC. And I thought this quote, which I found in the Wall Street Journal from late last month, is rather instructive. This is from the August 29th Wall Street Journal, and the headline says it all. For China boss, deep water rigs are a, quote, strategic weapon, unquote. The full quote from CNOOC Limited Chairman Wang Yilin is this, quote, large-scale deep water rigs are our mobile national territory and a strategic weapon, unquote. Purchasing large amounts of oil sands territories and operations as strategic weapons, in the words of the company's own chair, certainly requires that Canadians look at it as a national security question. We're hampered in that by Stephen Harper's refusal to include an objective definition of national security when the Investment Canada Act was amended in 2009. Nevertheless, we must ask these questions, and we specifically must ask, and I will ask in the House, when we'll see the specific text of the agreement that Stephen Harper has signed with China for investor protection. Because it was bad enough when U.S.-based corporations were able to sue municipal, provincial, or federal governments in Canada for what they claim was a loss of profits due to decision-making or regulations in Canada at the municipal, provincial, or federal level. But if, as it appears, China's companies, which are an extension of the state of China, will be allowed to sue Canada for democratically elected government decisions to protect our health or environment in Canada, if we are then susceptible to having to pay damages to Communist China, I think Canadians will have a lot of questions to ask. This agreement has already been signed by Stephen Harper when he was in Russia. We need to see the text, and we need to debate whether he's giving Canada away to Communist China without even allowing us to debate it in the House of Commons. Merci beaucoup. Je regrette beaucoup que je ne fais pas beaucoup de commentaires en français, mais je suis disponible pour les questions en les deux langues. Merci.